Hi everyone, and welcome to The Conversations, a show brought to you by Wiley, a global leader in research and education publishing. This series is about exploring the biggest opportunities in the world of academic publishing. It's about asking tough questions and getting into meaningful debate about where our industry needs to go. With me today are Nicole Bishop and Reid. Nicole is the founder and CEO at Quartolio, and Chris is the Director of Product and Publishing Development at Science. Now, let's start the conversation. Nicole, Chris, welcome. Thanks a lot for coming. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to meet with us. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of our discussion today, just tell our audience and each other a little bit about your backgrounds. And I'm just really curious about how you kind of got here. So we'll start with you, Nicole. Like, what brought you into this, into the space you're at in your career right now, and just a little bit about how you got here?
Sure, thanks so much. So first, we help scientists and doctors leverage 100% of the health data to make decisions versus the less than 1% up until now. And got into that leveraging AI from over 25 years in tech, which started in digitizing academic content at university libraries. But one day I woke up for work and I couldn't see out of my left eye due to a misdiagnosis as a child and all the wrong treatments throughout my adulthood. I was days away from going blind, but I met the right doctor who had done his research, and he saved my sight. And that led to me transforming 25 years of in tech into an organization that leverages all of science to move research forward faster.
When you say, I'm super curious about this, when you say like 1%, 99%, tell us what you mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a massive amount of scientific data from that produced by the 17 national libraries, laboratories in the U.S., articles, clinical trials, patents, policy documents, and all these documents as a collective possess knowledge that can solve our biggest problems. But it's just simply sitting there. And we've gone as far as asking a simple question of that data. But I believe that that data can guide us to the next steps in evolving science. What are we doing this for if not to move science ahead? And so that's what we leverage AI to do.
I want to come back to that sort of unlocking knowledge that's locked away conversation, because it is, for me, one of the big drivers of this project of digital transformation. Yes. But Chris, just tell us a little bit about how you got where you are and your work at Science.
Certainly, yeah. So I have a slightly different background. So I come from much more of the publishing side. So I've been with AAAS and Science for about 5 years now. And prior to that, I was with Oxford University Press. And reflecting on it, actually, I think one of the interesting things about my journey and coming through the career is how much technology has been pervasive in the background. That I think I joined, I was very fortunate to start working in publishing at a point where technology was really instrumental and beginning to take over in everything we did. And so looking at that and then looking at what science is trying to do now is there's a lot of commonalities there. It's ultimately what we're trying to do is communicate science. That sounds very easy. It's massively complicated. I think one of the things that we all struggle with is the vast volumes of content and of data and how we help scientists. And I think that's really ultimately what we're trying to do day to day. And technology, publishing technology is instrumental to that. It's a fascinating place to be. Science is part of the AAAS. It's a society publisher. We are very uniquely placed. I think I hope we're a very well-known brand. People know us, but that comes with a lot of responsibility. So the challenge in technology is getting it correct as well. It's building trust in science, reinforcing trust in science.
It is. I mean, this data question is one of the things that connects what both of you do. And I think data is a really interesting place to start our conversation. Do you think we've got, as a group of people working on these same problems, right? Do you think we've got our arms around sort of the data that doesn't show up in the papers? All right, so you say there's clinical trials, there's reports, there's case studies, but isn't there something in academia that that kind of gives incentives for scientists not to share their data, and we only see like the tip of the iceberg in your journal or in the data that the national labs produce. Like, how do you think about it in your world? How do you get behind this big data problem?
Absolutely. So even when we just think about the number of submissions for, to be published, and the perhaps 1% that is actually published, and all that massive data that is useful to solving science's problems, but it's being left alone, and all the data as well that, when it comes to science, what went wrong. It's very valuable to understand what went wrong and have the ability to analyze that against what is going right, and perhaps unlock that to lead us to that. So, one of the things that we did is develop a platform that would allow that, from the moment that you're creating that science, whether you're publishing a protocol, an article via an open access or another platform, you have this ability to move it seamlessly to a platform that can leverage natural language processing, different aspects of AI to transform that into knowledge that can be utilized to move science ahead. So that's the way we look at it, is that data should not simply be a data point or a visualization on a dashboard, but it's truly a key, a component to how do we solve this problem? And it's humanly impossible. Health data, there's about 1 billion, 1 terabyte, hard drives worth of health data. It's impossible to simply ask a question of that data or search through it and get what you need to get. And so by bringing all that data together and leveraging AI in a very specific way, we can leverage that data to guide us to the next steps instead.
So Nicole brings up an interesting point, Chris, and I hear it all the time, and I'm sure at Science you guys hear it. Nobody's interested in publishing null results. You can't make a career, you can't get tenure by explaining to the world all the things that didn't work. They're only interested in the new and the novel, not the sound science, not the case reports. Those aren't the things that the academic reward system keys off of. How do we even begin to wrap our arms around all the work that we're not seeing, that isn't showing up and getting submitted to your journals or Wiley's journals?
Gosh, it's a great question. And I think some of the responsibility sits with societies and publishers. I think a lot of it does sit with academics themselves and the institutions and the reward mechanisms and the incentivization. There is no incentive to publish that data.
Right.
As you just said, if you want to build a career, get tenureship, go on, you need to publish in the very best journals. I know that can be quite a loaded term at times, but if your experiment fails, there's no win in sharing that. There is a win, of course, for society, because if another PhD student does the same thing and didn't realize you tried, that's inefficient, essentially. How we solve that is a challenge. I think it has to start in the academy itself, within the institutions, and have a reward mechanism for doing that. I think, in fairness, I think preprints and other things do go some way to helping with that.
Sure.
But they are not as recognized.
All right. So, go ahead.
Yeah, speaking, to inefficiencies, research productivity has been declining 7% every year. Over $200 billion in biomedical research alone is just on redundant research. So it's deeply important for when we think about this catching of the net that we can have with all the data that might not get published or might not have worked out, that may be where we can recover that $200 billion, not wasting those funds on research that's already been attempted, or perhaps go a different direction. So, in speaking to preprints, I think it does come down to technology and platforms that can be, there can be incentives from a revenue perspective or what have you, to have platforms that feature that exact type of data, and having that data available makes it available for platforms like my own, AI platforms to then analyze that data in regards to what has worked, what hasn't, and then also from an administrative standpoint, and say, okay, we're not going to go in this direction because it's already been explored.
I'm going to show my age here.
Okay.
All right, but let's talk about preprints as an example of the challenge with pace of adoption of technology in the academic publishing and the scholarly publishing space. So I'm old enough to remember when the first preprint servers were set up, and they were called servers. and they were set up at the Los Alamos National Labs, and they were, it was called the Lanel preprint server. It was physics, right? Today it's called archive. Yes. But 25, 30 years ago, it was set up on the early internet as a way for physicists just to share work before it got submitted to journals. Today, 30 odd years later, we still don't have uniform preprint coverage across all of the domains. Now, what is it about this industry or this space that makes it so hard for new technology to get adopted uniformly? Why are we sort of in this world where, we have all this consumer technology that is super high end, and yet the technology we use to manage the most important research done in the world is maybe not where it ought to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. My instinct there is I'll push back slightly, because I think there are areas where actually we've adopted things pretty quickly. Yeah. I think the question mark is the need for adoption, right? Is to say, well, actually, sometimes and we think about this quite a lot at science, right? I'm trying to think of a particularly good example. There's always hot areas within publishing. New technologies, research integrity is actually a really good case study of that. Yeah. The thing we find in our internal discussions is trust. And so if we pick on maybe AI as a good example of this, the AI, as a catch-all term, has so much promise, and I'm sure we will talk about it a lot today. One of the things we're looking at doing potentially is saying, well, actually, is there a way of using AI to create plain language summaries to help with the accessibility of our content? Sure. So the classic question there, if there's a physics article and you're a biologist, maybe there's a value of it, but you aren't trained in that field, so a language summary could help you. AI is a great way of doing that. But even if it hallucinates 1 in 10,000 times, that lack of trust is a problem. And I think this is, and going back to the preprint point, that is a sort of a challenge there as well. And preprints are a very divisive topic within scholarly publishing, within academia. Fields feel very strongly both ways about it. But it's how to get the content that's, as much as possible, and I have to say as much as possible, because peer review is not a perfect process. I think it's the least worst process. But it's, how to build that trust. And I think, to answer your question perhaps more directly, is with technology, and that's maybe with a slow adoption, as an industry, we have to be a little more conservative at times and not rush to do things. Because if we did something and then we build problems for ourselves down the line by sort of not ruining, I shouldn't say that, but damaging in some way the integrity of the scientific records, then we can build problems for ourselves in the future. And so I think that does speak to the kind of, the sometimes slow slow progress we see with technology. Although I do actually think that is probably about to change quite significantly.
Absolutely. I think trust is definitely, one of the factors. But with that, legacy of the ideas of how things should work, legacy of research procedures, legacy technologies that have been, in existence for decades and that are not capable of moving, research forward and publishing forward in a way that's truly progressive. And so, legacy is okay. And if we approach the technology from a certain perspective, we can essentially add layers to that legacy. And so that we can transform that legacy into the future, something that we can really, to build on, whether it's the platforms that exist or existing publishing platforms. So legacy, I think, is definitely, it's deeply important. But when it comes to innovation, we have to shift our ideas of how we approach it. And that's one of the things that we can do. And speaking to, AI, and for instance, I think one of the main use cases that we've seen is we can summarize everything. But my personal standpoint is that's what abstracts are for. We can do so much more with AI, with the massive science that we have and academic content beyond, a summary. And the hallucinations are very, very real. When it comes to science, from making up new authors that authors that
making
don't
up
exist,
entire articles,
making up what we've seen enzymes when we've tested different models against our own. So I think it comes down to very specific use cases and building AI for those use cases by discipline, so that we can solve those problems according to that specific discipline without those hallucinations.
At the end of the day, we're talking about data. Every single thing that every item in a scholarly article, right? The name of the author, where that author works, who paid for the research, the number of co-authors, the email addresses, the content in the abstract, the methods, the figures, the tables, all these things could be formulated as data. But I would argue that today, the vast majority of that stuff gets treated as text and images without a lot of metadata and without much semantic enrichment to help us understand it. And I think, one of the things we're working on at Wiley is to change that with our new submission system, where we actually break everything down and treat it as data, as opposed to just plain, if you will, dumb text. But what do you do with all that data once you get it? And where do you draw the line? Data mandates from funding agencies, Nicole, require scientists to deposit their data in certain places. Should publishers be doing that? Should institutional libraries be doing that? How do we get our arms around this big data problem? Because all the ocean buoy data in the world that's collected to make one research paper isn't something I think Wiley can afford to host. But I'm not sure that we can't afford not to disclose it, to the point about making research more efficient. So how do you think about that problem?
Yeah, if we are in the true business of what we say we are, and advancing science, advancing research, then we need that data. Figuring out how to host it, where to host it, and things like that. There are, whether it's startups and things like that, there are, in the great AI race, everyone's looking for data. And if you're in a possession of that data, you can monetize that data.
Sure.
And so there's that incentivization from the corporate side of, we have this data, and would you like to access it to train your AI models? And then we can all go about the business of science and solving it, while also, making that data more valuable from multiple standpoints in the research, and then of course from a possible, the potential to monetize that data. So indeed, I do believe that all of that data is valuable, and it can be made more valuable and should be made available. Absolutely.
At Science, how are you guys thinking about this?
So really, it's tough for us, actually, because I think it starts with the authors and getting the authors to want to do it and incentivizing them to do it. We're in a fortunate place that at Science, because of who we are and our brand, that we have people are happy to jump through hoops to get published. And so we do use that. And what I mean by use that is to say, well, actually, let's promote best practice. Let's say, well, we do need your data. We do need this. And we do end up in some situations where we're perhaps competing for papers where that can be difficult. But we are very clear with our instructions on our sides and say, we need you to follow these guidelines. We need you to provide the data to you. But it is a challenge, and it is going to become more of a challenge. And I think actually there's an opportunity there as well. So maybe when we talk about challenge, it's an opportunity to say, well, this data, we're not doing the data for the sake of this. This is actually helpful. This is useful. This is good for transparency. This is good for integrity. This shields us from things where if you don't provide your data, there's a question mark around your research. And so it's good for the scientist. It's good for the publisher. That doesn't make it easy to manage at the same time. So it is something that we think about. The other part of it is economics. I'm going to come back to economics a few times. It's the cost of these things. We work with Dryad, we work with other people who have that data storage, but that comes at a cost. And so how do we continue to be sustainable while also incurring these extra costs and providing them to our readers and to our authors as well? So it's a challenge now. I think I was thinking about this a little earlier that with a lot of AI development, as AI begins to be able to access real-time footage, so an AI could watch you. There's this idea that if you're doing an experiment, AI can watch you and then write out your methods section. That avoids human fallibility to a certain point, but that's going to generate terabytes of data. And so how do we manage that? Exciting, interesting, but challenging.
So. You brought up methods, you brought up protocols a second ago. Wiley publishes a big database of protocols. This question around methods and this question around reproducibility of methods and the fine-grained detail that you need to provide, you're absolutely right. It's terabytes of information. In the biomedical field, it's not just, how many patients, but it's all that demographic data on those patients. It's a whole ecosystem of medical records, procedures, prescriptions, all this other stuff. I mean, where does the boundary between let's call it work at the bedside, work in the field, data collection in the lab on an instrument, and what gets published, where does that boundary need to move? Like, if we could take a blank piece of paper and start over again, we probably wouldn't say the right vessel for all this information is a PDF, right?
Yes.
I think all of us can agree that that's probably true if we were really about the efficiency and the communication. So 3 years from now, like, or 5 years from now, where would we be experimenting to like try to redraw those boundaries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the future is formatless. If we look at the evolution of publishing, going all the way back to the Gutenberg press, format, right? And then we had paper and we got to digital. And now we're in a space where we can leverage all of this knowledge to do more, whether it is to ask a simple question. But there are so many different formats and different, PDF has been very helpful in, disseminating, helping to disseminate information. And I think that's been very much the job of publishing. But in publishing, we have knowledge. So what if we're looking at it from a different perspective of not just disseminating knowledge and not just making it more discoverable, but actually to help move things forward? And formats is often the hindrance to that. And I think that when we talked a bit about legacy, you have the right technologies in place to lift that up and make those things formatless, make them more ready, for the web, web native, if you will, and the PDF being, sort of a print option to move the data along. But certainly when we have, this data in a the approach that we have is, throw it in a database, a repository. But what we look at is at a couple of different layers when we draw that out is we have the data, we have domain expertise, and then we have a decision layer that we put on top. And that can be existing platforms, because we understand very well that due to legacy, a lot of things might not change. But what we can do is add a layer that makes everything formatless with natural language processing and other technologies, so that we can, have that sort of a seamless way that when you publish something, it becomes part of a more of a collective knowledge and more accessible to more people.
So how did journals react to that? I mean, like, formatless makes a ton of sense, right? We're breaking down boundaries between point A and point B on the journey of a piece of scientific information. But journals have a front and a back. They have a cover and a final page. They have a method section, an abstract, and a list of citations. I mean, the formats are almost prescribed ritualistically. So how did journals evolve in that kind of, to meet that opportunity, I guess?
It's a challenging question. Let's put it that way. Now, I think that you have to be. The way I think about it is increasingly thinking about the production versus the consumption, right? So I think, as you've just been saying, I think not too far away, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, consumption and how we interact with that content is going to be quite different. I very much agree in terms of having this overlay that builds on top of that content to allow connections between areas you might not otherwise be made. On the production side, I think that's slightly different, because I think fundamentally, and I don't think I'm controversial in saying this, scientists like doing science. They do not like writing articles. They do not like that. So how do we continue to make that process easier for them? And actually, I think where having a format does help them, having a culturally, to use your word, sort of legacy approach of doing it in a very structured way is actually helpful for scientists. And I'm sure, no one enjoys writing a method section, and there's lots of ways to improve that. But actually, by having a set format that comes in and continues to go through that, and then we can build a layer on top of that interrogates that, I think that may be maybe it's not the long-term place, but it's certainly the medium-term place.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's a different perspective slightly. I think one thing we should be a little careful of is the PDF. The PDF has existed in its form and has been so well liked for a reason. And this is the same way. I think a perennial complaint about publishing is, when we say, well, the article hasn't changed in the last 400 years, that's a bad thing. I'm a little careful about that. There's a reason why it's persisted for 400 years. And that is a very big cultural legacy to move away from. That is not saying there shouldn't be change. It's just being away. I think, and Jay, I'm sure you've experienced this at Wiley as well. Every time someone tries to say, well, let's do something other than the PDF, the audience wants the PDF. it's very hard to move away from that. And there is a reason behind that.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of technology lends that we can have legacy and keep it in place. And so when I say formatless, is not the throwing away of how we do things, is actually enshrining it and allowing you to do exactly what you've always been doing. But we have that layer that says, this is how you're doing things. And we're going to take all of these PDFs, because what we do is we process PDFs, we process, CSVs and all the different formats.
Yep.
But in that layer that we have on top of it, that's where it becomes formatless, so they can flow more freely, and we can extract valuable, points of connection. But also, I think it adds the ability to have layers of interactivity as well when you have that ability to take away those formats at that level, not at the science level. You're at the bench, you're at your bedside, do exactly what you've been doing, as it so evolves. But with technology, we can evolve that while maintaining legacy, I think.
Yeah, and actually, and to go back to your question a little bit, is to say, I think this is one of the challenges for publishers. It's a public challenge for societies with our different societies, different journal portfolios. And I think this is going to be the big challenge in the next maybe 3-4 years, is say, well, actually, we're in a place where if you want to engage with scientist content, you go to science.org, you read our content there. Is that going to be the same in 5 years' time? Maybe not. You probably will go to, who knows which winners will evolve in 5 years, but let's say for our sake of argument, Perplexity, I'll ask Perplexity the question, it'll pour out science. Is that damaging for our brand? That is a question for us. Should we?
Sure.
We don't want to be a commodity that fuels these tools.
Yep.
How do we actually get into that tool business as well? And so that's a very difficult question. That's something that's occupying a lot of thought internally. We don't want to be commoditized. We don't want our brand to be devalued because of that. But at the same time, we need to be part of that, because if that's where researchers are finding their research and getting their answers, we need to be there. We need to be at the point where meet the researchers where they are. And so squaring that circle is certainly going to be the challenge, I think, the next decade, probably.
Is this just another version of the same dilemma that publishers were facing 20 years ago when we built all these websites to host our journals, and then discovered that nobody was coming there to do any searching, and that all the searching was coming from PubMed and Google and those other things? And is this another version of that? Or is it more fundamental than that? I'll tell you how we're thinking about it. We're thinking about it in the sense that we don't want these large language models trained on bad stuff. We want them trained on good stuff. We think that it's crucial that we embrace AI for the reason that these models must have access to peer-reviewed data. They must have access to peer-reviewed content, because we don't want them going out on the Common Crawl data set on the public internet or on pirate websites or other things. We need to create both legal pathways and copyright respecting pathways for this, but also we just want the models to be smarter. So, are we worried about the wrong thing, I guess, in the sense that I'm worried about click-throughs to my PDFs, or should I be more outcomes focused? I'm struggling with this topic, so I'm just interested in how you guys think about it.
I think that's a bit where legacy, speaking to both points, where legacy lends its hand a bit. There is a very prescribed way you citations. The progression of science is always going to, Wiley did it. Wiley helped with this innovation. That's going to be noted. So whether you're finding it via Perplexity or some other platform, there are procedures, and you're going to need to follow those procedures. And I do think that there's a bit of, the period of time that you mentioned. Some of the work that I did, in academia was actually a bit gaming those results, with work with Google for academic content, and that had a change of heart. So I was.
Just you needed to use your powers for good.
That's exactly how it happened. Like a very, very superhero moment. No, I'm doing not doing the right thing here, but doing the job, I had at hand, and that was indeed making sure that you found certain articles and what have you via Google Scholar and what have you.
Right.
So
sure.
very much on the other side, there have been, folks doing exactly that. But my perspective was to turn it on its head and understand that we're not always going to know what we need to look for. And in that, I see a number of different opportunities, be it a platform, that is leveraging AI, or, some of the repositories that we have right now. Ultimately, they're leading back to and clicking through to that PDF whether Wiley's hosting it or another publisher. And I think so that's more around discoverability, and that's just a channel to discover for data. I think it's opening up the possibilities, and wouldn't you want more opportunities for Wiley's articles to be found?
So, I mean, you and I get to think about that, Chris, but we also have to worry about the economics, as you mentioned, right? And so that disruption question is big. I mean, but we didn't see that, all of the doomsday scenarios, if you will, of disintermediation when we went online. Those didn't play out. Are these things, in your opinion, a flash in the pan, or is it more serious?
I do think it's more serious.
Yeah.
And I think if we look back to 1996 or a little bit later, with Google, there's a kind of a deal you make with Google, right? You make your content available so it can be discoverable, and I think discovery is a word we'll come back to a lot.
Yep.
But actually, with AI, that isn't the same deal. And I think the problem, on going back to the sustainability side and the kind of economic side, is the majority of business models that have sustained journals for hundreds of years are based around usage. And so if you take the usage away, so if you change the equation so no longer discovery drives usage, drives the business model, that it raises a big question about sustainability. And I think the worry I have that if we think working with institutions can be challenging at times, in terms of subscriptions and other things, working with giant AI companies is going to be far, far, far more challenging. And so that is like, there's a circle. It's very hard to square there, because they say, these organizations, the perplexities of the world, need great content for them to work. So therefore, they're probably going to have to in some way pay for that great content. Sure. But they're not very likely to be willing to. So how does that act out in future? And I think there are different business models out there which start to address that, but no business model is flawless, right? So it is to go back to your point, I think it is a very serious point. I think this is we keep talking about AI, and I think if you talk to different people about AI, there's a lot of hype around it, and I think a lot of people are kind of the bulls and the bears are saying, well, the hype's overblown, and it's all going to come crashing down. I don't see that. I think there is probably too much hype, and we'll probably plateau. But I do see it as changing, and I think it's particularly changing our industry, because how, to get back to what we were saying in the beginning, how researchers interact with our content is going to fundamentally change. And I think that's a good thing. It should do. There should be disruption. What we said in the introductions, we're all in the scientific communication business, and so we can't just say, well, a PDF is good enough. That's none of us is saying that.
I mean, I think we're in the communication business, but we're also in the facilitation of impact business, right? Like so I want to pivot a little bit and talk about what I think, one of the things that keeps me up at night is this question around standards. And I know standards can sound really boring, but they're the thing that makes everything work. And so just take biomedicine or take healthcare. The way that prescription dispensing system in a hospital connects to an electronic health record in that same hospital, there's a standard for how those two machines talk to each other. And those standards are set by, some industry groups and a couple of technology providers. And that works in the US and maybe in the UK and a couple other places that buy these software packages, and they're all the same software packages. We publish in everything from astronomy to zoology. And that means that we've got multiple standards for multiple domains. And the physicists and the chemists can't agree on anything, and they're only talking about atoms, right? And so when and to say nothing of like the society role in all this, the society convening role. So let me start with you, Chris. As a convener of societies, AAAS convenes not just its own journals and its own journal community, but it's a society of societies in a lot of ways. And that's a big part of what you do. As we think about data standards for bringing data off a machine into a PDF, formatless, take the head off, publish a slideshow and a spreadsheet, publish some Python code and a PowerPoint, do an AI augmented method section, whatever you want to talk about. Who sets the standards for how all that works across so many different domains? Geographies, regulatory regimes, funding regimes. How do you even begin to get your head around this? And when you guys sit there and do your blue sky work, which I know you do at at AAAS, at science. How do you get your head around it?
With difficulty is the sort of short answer. Yeah, and to flesh it out, there are so many initiatives. And NISO does fantastic work in that kind of area of standards, and there's so many. If we pick on ORCID, for example, they have made great steps with those. I think the challenge, actually, maybe I won't talk about the challenge. Maybe I'll talk about the optimistic side, the hope. Yeah. Again, without putting all the eggs in the AI basket. Yeah. I think I'm very excited that the way that AI can interpret text and look at the context around it is maybe we don't need I think
so we're just going to plow through with horsepower.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
I mean, maybe, right?
Maybe. I mean, I think it's. But I think to your point, right? It is. If we try and say. There's a classic cartoon, I'd have to dig it out, but where they say, well, we're going to create, there's 5 standards, none of these work, we're going to create a super standard, and they create a 6th standard, and then there's a 7th and an 8th. They're just, no one can ever agree. And so maybe that's our base. Let's say, well, actually, there isn't going to be a standard, and so we need to find a way of having a tool that sits in some way and interprets this and converts it. I think with, because it's something I do really struggle with, because in some ways it's very easy, and in reality it's very difficult. Like even when we're looking at institutions, right? The way an author calls their institution, it varies almost every single time. Sure. And ultimately we're dealing with humans, and so without forcing them to do something, which is very unpopular and very challenging, is there a way of sort of having a sort of intermediary step which allows that to say, well, actually, they're saying this and they're probably meaning this. And actually, I'll do a shout out here to an article on the Scholarly Kitchen quite recently by Tim Vines from DataSeer, who talked about probabilistic metadata. And actually, I think that's I haven't read the comments, but I think it's very interesting. Like you can say, if this and that, then probably you can make this assumption. And it's 99% true. Now, in science, as I just said at the beginning, trust is everything. So we want to be as close to 100% as possible. But where do we draw the line between actually 99% at this cost is fine versus 100% at a cost we can afford, and therefore it would be 0. Right. So that's, I think that it's an interesting, I'd recommend anyone to go and look at that article. Is a really, really powerfully written one. In the context of publishing, right, one of the things we're investing a lot of time in is it is getting that, at least from where we first see the content at this point of submission. You keep talking about the number of submissions we get. Probably since we sat down, my organization's probably gotten 60 submissions, right, in the time we've been talking. And that's 24/7, 365. And so when you bring in all this data, and it's relatively unstructured, and you're trying to standardize it, where do you put the burden? We've decided to put the burden on machines to do a lot of that inference, a lot of that probabilistic stuff. But we're also using reference tools to say, we're going to describe MIT the same way every time. We're going to describe the University of Pennsylvania, Cambridge University the same way every time, so that we can at least have some standards around author metadata, institutional metadata. But the science data, the data that's coming in, you do one of the things that makes me crazy, and maybe you could tell me how I cannot be crazy anymore, is we get data from, let's say, a mass spec machine, right? We get a picture of an atom, right? And we have some infrared spectrometry on this thing. It's got all this metadata from the machine, time of day, when it happened, temperature in the room, method used, size, sample size, all this great stuff. And it all gets thrown away by the time it shows up in a Wiley journal or in a science journal. And we have just a dumb TIFF image with a little bit of a wrapper on it, or a JPEG. And then we smash that into a PDF, and we go, ta-da, and all this data's left on the cutting room floor. Tell me about how we fix this, because I am stuck on this. We confront that every day. We love to get in the thick of every, that's why I talk about formatless, because that's what we built the technology to, even those odds that you're consistently facing. So our approach is, you have that, that data from the, you may be left with the image, but we take everything that there is, and we might pin it for later and put it in a different, area of things. And it comes down to contextualization. You were talking about the different disciplines. AI can do far more than summaries, far more than have this perspective of what
I would say is the popular and current perspective, but AI has existed for decades. For us, for data nerds and analytics and AI nerds, this has existed for decades. And so this current approach that's popular, large language models, is not the only approach.
Okay.
We have a causal AI perspective that looks at things entirely different. It isn't this brute force, we're gonna, present, we're gonna, analyze all this data, and then you can ask it a question. And that comes to the user experience, because that's what it's been, is you're having a chat and conversation. But we are just at this is very nascent, right? That's the experience that you have today, but it's constantly evolving, and we have a very different perspective on how the AI is sharing knowledge with you, and thus changing how you discover data, and indeed putting up front, this is where this data came from. So we have very much an approach of, giving you cues along the way that perhaps this is the drug that you should look into. Perhaps this is the, lab test that you can look into, but as well, here's the evidence, whether it's coming from Wiley or another publisher. So we take all of that data, understanding that there's going to be an opportunity to leverage it at some point, and we actually are leveraging some of it right now. But AI can solve those problems, inclusive of contextualizing the data per discipline, which is exactly what we do.
Right. Yeah. So it's like that AI version of the probabilistic metadata point that was made earlier.
Just to jump in, I do wonder if there's a sort of, I was going to say a fork in the road. And what I mean by that is to say, maybe this should have happened and has happened already, and we just don't think about it, or I don't think about it in this way, is to say, well, actually, fundamentally, journals are produced for humans. That's a very obvious thing to say, of course, but should we start thinking about actually having two forks, that there's a human format and there's a machine format.
Right.
And we say, well, actually, this version is consumable by humans, but this version with all the extra data is much more machine friendly. How we do that is challenging. But because one of the things I think we've talked about before, but coming back to, is the volume of research, right? And AI has a great potential to help with that, but actually and to build connections. But at some point, there will still be people reading things. So
evaluating those things, judging them. Sure.
Yeah. So when we're having these discussions in science, if we go back to I keep picking on perplexity, but if a scientist goes into perplexity, answered a question, I think what our estimation is still the majority will want to go back to the original paper. What we'll sort of say is, well, actually, those people who are just trying to find a single fact or just found the wrong paper, they'll be eliminated. But actually, we still need to have that human digestible piece. And so that's an element for hope. But we have to acknowledge at the same time, which is I think what we're all saying, that machines will be a much greater part of that actually we need to use this content to drive advances in other areas, and only machines can sift through that vast amount of data to do so.
Is there a version of the world where we as publishers aren't even a part of that value chain? That the CAT scan run on a bunch of adolescent brains doing a PTSD study, right? All that data just gets put into an AI, and the output gets created, the methods get described and publicized. And, we changed the academic reward, and the journal sort of goes, it is 400 years, a pretty good run, right? Maybe those formats just evolve beyond their useful life. And we think about, other ways that this stuff gets communicated. Is that a possibility, do you think?
I think that it's a transformation that can occur. What does it mean to be a publisher? I think when it comes to paper, that's thinking about the audience. They're always going to want to have that journal in their hand. There's always going to be the person that wants that PDF. And so I think it's going to be about, personalization to specific audiences, about what it is that they, want to consume and how they want to consume it, but in a sort of universal way, making it available to machines, so that the consumption can actually increase, because there's a greater deal of discoverability. We look at, a repository, DOAJ, and, or any, the NASA repository. Right. We've taken data from every one of the labs that produce science, and that data is just sitting there. So something has to be done with it, and it's being, there's data that's being published, but when it's simply sitting there and not being consumed, even say 86,000 on average, 86,000 articles published per discipline. Who's really reading all of that? It's, there's a great deal of impossibility.
I spend a lot of time on the weekend, and it's very, very busy.
There's a great impossibility of that. But I think that the transformation is when you transform that data into something new, that's what opens up new revenue models. So I think publishers exist. How they make money may change, and hey, that could be a very good thing. These are new revenue streams. But I think that it's an inevitability of the transformation. But I don't think that the publisher disappears. I just think that they morph into something new.
Okay, what do you think?
Yeah, so I was thinking about it from a sort of brand perspective,
right? And
so I think and I know this is a very, very controversial topic within the open access movement, within scholarly publishing as well. The term prestige publication, prestige journals is used a dint against us, certainly. But when we think about it, it is the reason our brand works is because you can have a certain set of assumptions about an article published in Science. Right. Now, everything we publish, we're humans, everyone makes mistakes, nothing is perfect. But I think on average, you can make the assumption that if an article is published in Science or any of the family journals or a science partner journal, that actually it's gone through a number of steps, it's been peer reviewed in such a way, it's got this high quality, which I know is a dangerous word and sometimes attached to it. And so you have that brand. And I think that continues actually because, I think that the counterpoint to, a lot of viewpoints where they say, well, actually, all we should do is just build a mega database and all scientists should put all their content in there. There has to be some way of filtering it. And I think what you'd find by doing that is you'd have brands emerging, you'd have different layers. Not everything is novel, not everything. And again, I want to be a bit careful because just because something isn't novel doesn't mean it's not important.
We talked about that earlier, right? The no result
is important. Yeah. But if you're a scientist, your time is extremely finite. How do you find a signal that says, well, actually, this paper is a breakthrough I need to read? And that's where, of course, I think this, and science thinks this, that having a paper published in Science is a way to do that. And so I think that's where journal brands and journals do continue. Do I think they'll be in the same shape? If we said 400 years, if I look 100 years in the future, which is madness, do I think we'll be in a similar place? No, absolutely not. Right. But I would, as custodian of a brand like Science, which is 100, I should know the age, 125, 150 years old, we do expect it to be around for at least another 100. And that's something that does occupy our thinking. And something that actually is a slight digression from your question, but I think it's something that a lot of societies deeply care about, is we see ourselves as the custodian of the journal today, but also for the future. Is there standing on the shoulders of giants that actually, is probably to our very first question, sometimes the slowness of adoption of technology, is to say, well, the legacy piece that actually we do expect this to be around. We're custodians of it for a certain moment and we'll pass it on to the next generation. And I think society publishers particularly feel that. That's, it's very important to us. And that's, and there is quite a lot of fear in the future about that. Yeah.
One final question, and maybe I'll start with you, Chris. As Wiley's a publisher. We've been around since 1807, right? But our oldest journal goes back to 1787. And, so yeah, we're totally invested in that legacy, and I completely understand that. But we're also a technology company that supplies you guys with a platform to publish science in the science partner journals and that family of journals. And we're venturing into things like AI for research integrity and checking for image manipulation. And we're spending a lot of time and energy trying to make the submission and peer review process better, because that technology is old, right? The technology that's standard in the market today is 25, 30 years old. If you had one wish for that domain, right? This, at the point of data collection, right? At that point of data collection, the things that enable you to get through the peer review, the preservation, the archive, all that, what would it be? Like, if you could wave a magic wand, what problem would technology solve for you in that space in 5 years?
Good question. So it's probably a human answer rather than a technology question. But I think the technology can solve the human problem. So I think, very much we think about things in upstream and downstream. Like I'm sure you do. That actually the more information we can collect upstream much the downstream. The challenge, of course, we don't want to create so many barriers for authors. So many journals, and we do this as well, have extra questions, because we need all that information. So the technology piece would be actually, and maybe this, I alluded to this earlier, so say, well, actually, is there a world, and maybe it's decade off, not 5 years, where actually AI is helping you with your experiment, it's watching you, it's written your methods section, it's generated a huge amount of data. Because again, when humans write these things, they're very selective. It's a problem that's riddled throughout method sections. So many times you read a method section, you say this, and this. Oh, well, hang on, they've missed out a step here, and a machine doesn't do it. So that would be my wish, that actually we can find a way to, again, I really want to focus it around helping authors and helping, maybe I should call them authors, helping scientists. To just make that process as easy as possible. Because again, I think I said this before, they want to be scientists. The publication is almost it's not an afterthought, it's almost an afterthought. And that work where they have to follow all these guidelines. So if we can
make
ease
that
them through
easier,
that, that would be the technological dream, I think.
Right. So it's focused on the user, it's focused on the focus. That's good product management, right? So, okay. If you had one wish, if you could say to the publishers, God, just get your act together here. What would it be at that point of like data collection, that upstream place that Chris was talking about?
Yeah, I'd say when it comes, back to legacy and adoption, there are technologies out there looking to, sort of create this formatless world, if you will, so that, we can leverage this data in new ways and actually solve some of those problems. And so it comes down to the conversations of, let's give this a try. So when it comes to the submission process as well, and modernizing the submission process and having that, having tools at that exact point will solve a lot of the issues that we've talked about, during this wonderful conversation. So I'd say, legacy needs to definitely be addressed. Adoption, whether it's startups or different partners and things like that. I think as long as that part of the mind is open, we can evolve publishing and bring it to the future that we have sort of imagined here today. So I'd say that it starts with those conversations because the technology is here. It's here today. It's just a matter of adoption.
Well, it does start with those conversations. And I think we've had a wonderful conversation today. So I want to really thank you both for taking time. We don't take it lightly. Everybody's, it's a busy world we live in. So I'm just personally grateful to both of you for coming and sharing insights and thoughts with us today. Thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun. And really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Great.
Yeah.